we're up to round 3, as I'm sure you all know, and whittled down to 6 wonderful players now. They got to choose from the Beethoven Opus 1, numbers 1 to 3 trios, and also the Ghost trio. And 2 have chosen number 2, 2 have chosen Opus 1, number 2, 2 have chosen Opus 1, number 3, and we have 2 of the Ghosts. So only Opus 1, number 1 are we going to miss out on. I thought it would be useful to start with a little bit of historical perspective of the Opus 1 trios. The early trios, and the Ghost comes from later on in Beethoven's career. The timeline is that in 1792, Beethoven moved to Vienna. He was absolutely famous, a firebrand pianist at the top of his form. He was not born as an aristocrat. He was Van Beethoven instead of von Beethoven, unfortunately for him. But he was a revolutionary, and he believed in the rights of the common man. So nevertheless, he did hope to marry an aristocrat's daughter at some stage, at this stage. In 1793, he composed this set of piano trios, the Opus 1 piano trios. So as I said before, 2 of our finalists, semi-finalists, have chosen to play the Opus 1 number 2 in G major, and 2 have chosen to play the Opus 1 number 3. So we're talking tonight about whether there is such a thing as a Beethoven violin technique. I fervently believe there is, and perhaps it's a little bit different if we're talking about Beethoven's early period or his middle period. So let's talk straight away about the early period. We'd have to say that the pieces are really devoted to clarity and rhythmic drive as opposed to lyricism. The articulation of the beginnings of notes is what is important. Like the piano has hammers that hit the beginnings of the notes, and of course these were vehicles for Beethoven, these trios. And certainly one would say that the violinist has to find a way to sound a little pianistic in these works. There's a wonderful writer called Galamian, who was a pedagogue and a violinist, who wrote about, I think it might be 17 different ways to put the bow on the string. And one of them is a technique called colle. And in colle, you actually put the bow on the string and then straighten your fingers in such a way that the beginning of the note gets a little ping, a tiny little accent. And I would think that some of the violinists would be looking to play with quite a bit of colle in their performances, a way to mimic the piano, to imitate the beginnings. And without that, sometimes the violinist can actually sound a little behind the piano, just a little bit late. So a lovely gentle ease into the notes will just allow the violinist to sound a little late. So we can expect to hear some fairly clear articulation to go with this period of music. The violinists will have spent a lot of time studying the score, the full score, that is, the piano, the cello and the violin part to see it all together on the one score. It is really true to say that the violin part alone is not going to make a lot of sense. It's really not the whole roadmap. In Opus 1, number 2, we will notice dynamic markings that are typically larger than life, as Beethoven was. At the opening, we'll see forte piano, sforzando, at decrescendo, and interestingly for violinists, decrescendo to the lowest note of the phrase. I should say that from the opening adagio, right from the very beginning, the piano's featured in the dominant role. Even in the largo, there's much florid piano writing. The finale is very pianistic, with lots of staccato and passage work, bravura piano writing, you could say. So in this context, the strings really need to be so linked with the piano part in musical intent, rhythmically, tonally, with pianistic articulation, so that they are actually heard as part of the bravura of the piano part. They don't want to sound like a couple of weak instruments that just tag along. They really want to collaborate and become part of this texture of being larger than life. They really want to sound like part of the virtuosity of the pianist. So I thought it was interesting on the website. It said, "What will the violinist experience whilst performing this work?" My feeling is that the violinist is going to be listening intensely and anticipating in such a way as never to sound late. The violinist will be leading the ensemble. The violinist is traditionally the leader. But really, the violinist is also going to be taking many cues from the piano. So it's this sense of who's leading whom, really. This is also very largely true of the trio in C minor. That's the Opus 1, number 3, which we also have 2 contestants playing. You'll hear a unison opening with dramatic use of dynamics. The violinist gets a small cadenza in bars 8 to 10 in the very opening of the C minor. The slow movement is in theme and variations form. Listen out for variation 5. It's the violinist's turn to have the solo, but the violinist gets it in these very icky double stops that are in a low part of the violinist's range. And this is something that as a violinist I can say about playing Beethoven. Often when you do have your moment of glory, it's such an awkward technical passage and it just comes upon you. You know, it might be something that's suddenly in octaves or in this case, double stops that lie in a fairly unflattering register of the violin. I'm sure our violinists are going to make it sound wonderful, but you can listen with a bit of inside knowledge to that. The cello too has the tune. It's a really wonderful, actually, set of variations. In the menuetto, which follows the menuetto, the pianist has all the passage work, but the violinist and cellist must provide the gravitas of the key, the gravitas that goes with C minor and with having all that impressive passage work. If the violinist and the cellist don't play in a suitably solemn manner, then all of that's wasted with the piano. And again, if they do play like that, they join the piano and become part of the texture. And this is just so much the case with these early trios. The finale is similarly a vehicle for the piano to really have passage work from almost beginning to end. One could really describe the strings as functioning like extra hands of the piano, which as a string player myself, perhaps I don't always like to admit, but in this music there's no room for an ego which separates you out from the three. You really want to be a part of it, so that, as I say, the totality of it becomes what you're expressing rather than your own line. I think it's probably useful to go back to our timeline now. So you'll remember that we're talking about 1793, which is right at the earliest part of Beethoven's career when we're talking about these 3 Opus 1s. But then skipping on to 1800, a few years are a long time in Beethoven's life. He started to lose his hearing at this stage. By 1817, his hearing was completely gone. However, this was the so-called middle period of Beethoven's career, and it was a singularly creative time for him. In 1804, he composed the Eroica Symphony. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. These were things that were really important in Beethoven's life. And in 1806, important for all violinists, a date to etch in our memories, the date when the Violin Concerto was composed. 1806, the Beethoven Violin Concerto. And just 2 years later is our piano trio, Opus 70, number 1. We call it the Ghost, though that was not named that way by Beethoven. In 1811, he wrote the Archduke Piano Trio. So that's sort of the relevant dates for what we're talking about tonight. And the other 2 of our 6 semi-finalists have chosen to perform the Ghost. In this trio, the violin and cello have a much more equal role with the piano. However, we still find Beethoven's liveliness and dramatic use of harmony, key, dynamics, and rhythmic drive, and thank goodness for that. Even when the strings sustain the themes, it may be above constant semiquavers, 16th notes, or quavers, 8th notes, in the piano part. So the violinist needs to play with a real ear to this underlying internal rhythm. Again, it is easy to sound late in this context. The second movement is quite extraordinary. It has very abrupt dynamic changes and long passages of really spooky, tremolo-like passages, particularly in the piano part. And this is why people started to call it the Ghost Trio. It earned itself this nickname. I think it's incredibly musically imaginative, this movement. The challenge for all the players, especially the violinist and the cellist, is to sustain the long lines of phrasing. They have just a little fragment to play, and then a rest, and then another little fragment. But actually, the line is huge. I don't know if anyone's had the privilege of seeing there's actually video footage of Zuckerman, Jacqueline Dupre, and Barenboim playing this movement in a church. And that's just a consummate example to me of maintaining the length of line. There's no way those players drop their musical intent when they're not actually playing. If you haven't seen it, it's one of those Christopher Newpen films, and it is really worth looking at. Okay, then the third movement is the last movement. This trio only has 3 movements. It also contains this same challenge, the challenge of creating long sweeps of music, despite the answering, interrupting snippets of the other players. Real teamwork is on display. The violinist must match the colours of the piano and the cello with, again, bow articulation, control of bow speed and bow pressure, especially in the second movement, you'll notice that, vibrato and intonation. Again, really intense listening, responding, leading, collaborating is going to be taking all of the violinist's attention. The violinist may also feel that he or she has to conduct with the bow very frequently. This is something that one does feel a lot when playing Beethoven. It's very interesting to talk about recent trends. How do we like our Beethoven played today as opposed to 20 years ago or 40 years ago? And given that the Violin Concerto was written 2 years before this piano trio, I think it's interesting to have a look at that. And 2 of my favourite recent performances of the Violin Concerto are one by Isabel Faust and another by Christian Tetzlaff. And they play the slow movement a lot faster than it's been played in the past. I was talking to a group of school children about this movement, and they said, "Oh, we don't like it, we can't even hear the tune." And I put Christian Tetzlaff's recording on, and they said, "Oh, is that how the tune goes?" So when it goes at a faster speed, they can now hear the tune and they can hear the variations. Christian Tetzlaff and Isabel Faust, they both also take... Beethoven actually transcribed this back to the piano, the violin concerto, and he wrote a cadenza for the piano version. And so Christian Tetzlaff and Isabel Faust both take that cadenza back to the violin, reworking it so that it's each in their individual way, so that we have this wonderful cadenza, which really is Beethoven. So really, I do think tastes and performance practice, we've heard a lot of playing on early instruments. We've had a lot of 19th century performance practice that we hear. I do think that has filtered through, and we do now expect our violinists to play with an ear to that. We're not expecting our violinists to play in a romantic, soloistic fashion. We're expecting to hear real fiery Beethoven, and Beethoven in all his moods in the Ghost Trio. It's a very interesting thing to talk about. We could talk about it for a long time, I'm sure. But time moves on, so perhaps I should summarise. Now, I was talking about Beethoven techniques for a violinist, and I can give a summary of that. In Beethoven's music, there is a limited use of the violinist's upper range. There's a top A in only one in Opus 1, number 2. We don't go much higher than that in any of them. There's a limited use of long, slow notes. This impacts on bowing, the use of legato, and also on vibrato too. The violinists will need to adjust their vibrati to perhaps a more slow and narrow vibrato. Certainly, it's not going to be a Tchaikovsky concerto type of vibrato that we're going to hear. Intonation, another issue. Often the scoring is very unforgivingly close in proximity to the piano. The piano tuning needs to be thoroughly embraced. The people may not realise that that's not going to be exactly the same as the tuning system that you'll use in a concerto with an orchestra. The violinist is going to be constricted by the way the piano is tuned. Articulation, as I said before, much attention to the front of beats, use of techniques such as colle and anticipating the beats, always required so as not to sound behind the pianist. The creation of long lines of music, even when Beethoven only gives you a snippet. The preparation that the violinists will have done, they'll all have thorough knowledge of the full score, encompassing the study of its harmonic and rhythmic structure and pacing. They'll have a real intent for teamwork. They will really mean us to hear the trio as a team. They'll have an understanding that good ensemble, and that has a lot of meanings, that word ensemble. Good ensemble makes the violinist sound better. You know, it truly does. A rogue violinist in a Beethoven piano trio does not sound better. I'm sure that's not going to be the case with any of ours. And the all-important question, what are the judges going to be looking for? Well, my number one on my list would be musical authority. They're looking for a violinist who really understands the music and stamps, when you listen to it, you just feel the authority of what they've got to say. They're looking for teamwork, as I said, leadership, listening and responding to the other players, responsiveness. They're listening for clarity of sound, pitch, rhythm. They're listening for the intonation and tonal choices. They are all choices. So harkening back to that word leadership, I do not mean the soloistic flair of the concerto soloist, which we'll all enjoy on Saturday. But this is a much more subtle and multi-layered sort of leadership. The dynamic of the three, where all the three players lead, they respond, they support and collaborate. And I noticed that we're in for a treat because in each night we have one of each of these trios. So tonight we're going to hear the Opus 1 number 2, the G major, and then we're going to hear the Ghost. So it's skipping on to Beethoven's later middle period. And then we're going to go back and hear the Opus 1 number 3, the C minor. So we really have a treat in store. I hope you enjoy yourselves. Thank you.